Hi guys, in this video we're going to talk about the Soviet Union and planned socialism in general. First step is to define socialism. I've got three definitions here that I pulled from various sources, and you can read them, but I want you to focus on some of the commonalities. The one from Merriam-Webster refers to collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production. The one from Wikipedia refers to social ownership, cooperative management of the economy. And the one from Britannica refers to ownership, public ownership of or control of property and natural resources. So the commonalities are very telling. Even though there's a variety of definitions of socialism, it usually comes down to government ownership, social ownership, and some sort of cooperative allocation of resources. So why socialism? Well, the obvious reason is not capitalism. Capitalism is usually the alternative, and socialism represents, to some people, a solution to the problems that capitalism brings. And the biggest problem for most people is the income, wealth, and consumption inequality of capitalism. So the movement towards socialism has a long history of trying to rectify this imbalance. But it could go beyond that. For some, it means not just equity in economic outcomes, but also in governing. They see it as a stabilizing force, maybe removing the business cycle that capitalism brings. Greater capital accumulation, putting government in charge of the whole economy. The government can make investment-oriented decisions and perhaps grow the industrial aspects of the economy faster than would a capitalist system. The best example of that would be during wartime, when even in the US, one of the most free market economies in the world, we use government to ramp up industrial production to pretty significant highs. And then for some, it also means ultimate utopia. These would typically be the Marxists. I want to be clear, not all socialists are Marxists. Marx believed, as we learned in socialism, being part of that evolution towards communism, and the ultimate utopia would be under a communist regime. But even though socialism is not as advanced as communism, it is part of the path to getting there. In a nutshell, it's better than capitalism, but not quite as good as communism. There's two types of socialism that we'll look at. In this section, we're going to look at planned socialism, and then later on, we'll look at what is called market socialism. There's many different varieties of market socialism, and none of them have really been used on a wide scale in any country. They're more theoretical, but China is undergoing what some would call the biggest market socialist experiment in history. That's debatable, but we'll save that for a later chapter. Where does socialism get its intellectual and historical origins? Well, it goes back before Marx, but Marx definitely brought attention to collectivism and this advancement towards, I should say, advancement away from capitalism. I don't want to just repeat the Marxist evolution here, but I do want to remind you that socialism is one step towards communism. And a few important notes here. It's a transition state during which we still have scarcity, but a strong state is required. That means the government is still used as a means of kind of purging the capitalist elements that have lingered. If you recall, Marx referred to a superstructure. So you can't just go from capitalism to communism. There has to be this period in between where the government tries to use its power to rectify a lot of those issues that capitalism brought about. It's, in Marxist view, a dictatorship of the proletariat. The proletariat was a working class, and they take over the means of production by controlling the government. They overthrow the bourgeois, which is a capitalist class. They reject democracy and usually opt for the totalitarian state, but again, controlled by the proletariat. And it's almost the practical application of a revolution to bring about communism. Productivity is rewarded in socialism. partly because of the superstructure of capitalism still being there. In other words, people need the incentives to go to work, and they're not going to just show up and produce in the factory and continue to advance the economic side of the economy unless they have those incentives. So if you don't work, you don't eat in socialism. Productivity is still rewarded, which does lead to unequal outcomes. Socialism is not, in the Marxist sense, a income equal society. Because it's still anchored down by the inequalities of capitalism. It takes time to move through socialism to get rid of all those oppressive elements of capitalism and kind of be liberated from the problem of scarcity, where people will go to work because they want to go to work, and they no longer need those material incentives or moral incentives. Ironically, the greatest resemblance between the Soviet Union and the capitalist model was in labor markets. Workers were rewarded based on their efforts and their productivity. There was a hierarchy. Some people made more than others. Some people had a higher standard of living than others. There was not the kind of equality that sometimes people equate with socialism. It doesn't mean they weren't on a route to achieving that, but the actual real world incarnation of planned socialism was quite unequal. And then communism, according to Marx, would be the highest stage. No markets, no money, no abundance, no state, no inequality. If you think about it, it's kind of a reversion back to that communal state, but in a modern time frame. Marx is famous for saying, from each according to ability to each according to need. So scarcity is eliminated, not because we have found an abundance of resources that allow us to maintain a high standard of living, but instead we no longer need the high standard of living. There's plenty if you lower your expectations. For Marx, this meant that people would go to work, they would produce, whatever they had left over, they would share with others. They didn't want affluence, they didn't want opulence, they didn't want anything beyond basic material goods to survive. And so if they had leftovers, they just give it away. This is an interesting kind of idea. And again, it may be the goal of socialism to get to this ultimate utopia, but it may not be. And don't assume that because a country is adopting a planned socialist kind of regime, that they actually are trying to get to communism. That's very debatable. Another important figure in socialist history is Vladimir Lenin. And he came to gain a lot of influence during the Russian Revolution. He's considered one of the Marxist revolutionaries, part of the Bolsheviks, who seized power from the Russian Tsar in 1917. The Marxist revolutionaries, after gaining power, underwent a Russian civil war with the Mensheviks, and they were successful bringing about the leader Vladimir Lenin. So you probably know of Lenin as the founder of the Soviet Union, which, as we've talked about, is the largest planned socialist experiment we've had in history. Vladimir Lenin is also known for the Red Terror, mass killings, torture, and political repression of rebel forces by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Civil War. It was a bloody environment, and the quest to bring about a socialist state was quite violent. It's important to keep this in mind because whether you believe in the socialist kind of ideology or not, there are costs to achieving revolutions, and it's both ways. I mean, the revolutionaries in the U.S. created a lot of human loss in their quest for democratic freedom. Similarly, there are huge costs associated with trying to create a new socialist state. Lenin's war communism, the Soviet economic system that was implemented during the Russian Civil War from 1918 to 1921. During this period, Lenin nationalized all industry and criminalized private enterprise, effectively trying to eliminate capitalism and the superstructure. Production collapsed, no surprise there. Anytime you transition from one major economic system to another, there's usually a collapse. A perhaps redeployment, but at least for a while, serious unemployment. 80% drop in industrial and transportation and 35% drop in agriculture. So at this point, Lenin is unveiling a system that is not looking very pretty. So they start to bring in the experts to try to make this work. And in 1920, this guy, Nikolai Bukharin, wrote the ABC of Communism. And this was an attempt to try to convince workers that if they were willing to undergo the costs of all of this, the blood and the work and the unemployment, that they would eventually own all the means of production. They would effectively be able to get access to everything that they need whenever they need it. It's a communist agenda, an attempt to try to convince people that they are better off with a different system. The National Economic Plan was the implementation that Nikolai Bukharin proposed, and it was going to direct resources towards the most important sectors of the economy. Obviously, that's going to be a lot of the heavy sectors, steel industry, manufacturing, those types of things. Planning was going to be done by proletariat specialists, not bureaucrats. Bureaucrats would be political minions, political insiders, whereas proletariat specialists would be kind of the engineers, the ones that bring knowledge and expertise to a particular line of production. So it's very attractive to bring in specialists rather than politicians. Chaos and confusion would exist, but it would be transitory as workers organized production towards a united front. The whole idea of the National Economic Plan was to try to get people to accept the chaos that was already existing. This is common in a lot of societies that undergo revolution. There's kind of the peacemakers that try to say, hey, just accept this right now. Things are going to get better. And when they're better, they're going to be great. It's going to be better than you've ever known. And so that was part of the marketing that underlied the Lenin regime. Interestingly, Bukharin was later killed by Stalin as a insider that kind of went awry. So clearly things were not pretty in the early part of the Lenin regime. So by 1921, he had implemented the new economic policy, which was going to be a grand system that would bring back a lot of those productive elements. Some privatization of industry was restored for smaller enterprises, replicating kind of what we might call market socialism. Commanding heights is what the government would control. So this is actually what you see in a lot of socialist countries today. The government doesn't get that involved in the day-to-day minutia of business. They allow small mom and pop businesses to exist, make money, profits, and so forth. But they do take over industries. They might take over the oil industry. They might take over the energy, utilities, communications, transportation. This is what you see in China. This is what you see in Venezuela and some other countries, even in Cuba to a certain extent. And it appeared to work. Production improved. By 1927, the economy was at pre-war communism levels. Lenin did not see this improvement. He passed away in 1924. Okay, that's where we'll stop with this video. I'll pick up with Stalin's Great Break in part 2 of this section. All right, thanks, guys.